Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, our last one in May. And I was actually just catching up with Verity and Rick before, one of the last events that I know the Ombudsman is able to do before the election. So I'm delighted to have you with us today. To everyone new, it's lovely to see so many people with us who've not been on the Social Housing Roundtable before, but also so many familiar faces. So great to have you with us today. My name's Matt Baird. I founded and have run the Social Housing Roundtable now for nearly 3 years. The idea was to bring forth a free platform for all that gave people a chance to have a true, honest and authentic conversation around a huge range of topics. We've done over 120 of these. The majority of recordings are available on Spotify and YouTube. Just search the Social Housing Roundtable or reach out to me for the mailing list. And what I've loved about doing these is that it's always a place where it's highly respectful, but everyone's opinion is valued, whether you're new to housing and been in here for 2 weeks or whether you're a 30+ year veteran of the sector. It's lovely to have you in the space with us today. So I'm hoping for lots of questions and insight that come from all of you. I just ask that everyone is treated fairly and with respect, as I say. On a quick side note, so I've been working in social housing recruitment now for 11 years. The reason this stays free is because a number of people who I can see some familiar faces have used me for their recruitment. That money gets back funded into this to keep this running for free. So if you are a hiring manager or you're looking for work, do reach out. It'd be great to speak to you. And we can keep this running as a free platform for all. So on to why we're all here today. I'm delighted to welcome Rick Blakeway and Verity Richards from the Ombudsman with us. We're going to start with Rick today, who I think is going to give a bit of a general wider overview, and then pass on to Verity, who's going to talk more in depth about the complaint handling code and some more specifics and data and insight that they're finding from the sector more broadly. If you are looking to ask questions in that kind of first 15 minutes or so while Rick and Verity are speaking, please do stick anything you like in the chat. If you do any thumbs up on those posts, then I'll make sure those questions get asked first. But after that 20 minutes, half an hour that we've got with Rick and Verity, it will be a more open forum discussion, and I'll do our very best to get any questions we can asked. I've also spoken to Verity before. The chat log will be saved, so any questions we don't get around to, we will do our best to come back and actually get an answers out to you all as well afterwards. So without further ado, Rick, I'm passing across to you. I'm genuinely delighted to have you with us today. I know we've worked on a few projects together, but it's fantastic to have you come onto the Social Housing Roundtable, so welcome.
Cool. Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you to everyone who's joined this morning, fresh after a bank holiday to talk about complaints. And I know there'll be a high awareness amongst folk who've joined of the kind of work that is happening at the Ombudsman and the role that we envisage for the complaint handling code. I think probably I just in a few minutes just kind of make a couple of observations or a handful of observations. The first is it's obviously a complex and challenging operating environment for landlords, and I think complaints can get pushed to the margins during those times, but actually we see complaints as kind of central to helping landlords navigate that environment. And as an ombudsman service, we're obviously seeing the challenges that landlords are, that challenging operating environment just through the volume of casework coming to us. I mean, I'll say this figure twice because I think it definitely needs reflecting on. But in the last 3 months, we've determined more than 2,000 formal investigations. That's 2,000 formal investigations in the last 3 months. And if you think about it, when I started the service, that would be over half a year's work for the Ombudsman service. And go back a few years before that, that would be the full year's work for the Ombudsman service. So I think that's the kind of one expression of both how we're, seeing the resources, additional resources we have as an organisation having impact, but also the kind of issues and challenges that landlords will be experiencing. So I hope above all else, the code is there to support landlords to strengthen their internal complaints procedures, to ensure there isn't a postcode lottery around the country on the experience of complaint handling, but to strengthen those procedures. Because that's one of our clear objectives as an organisation, is to see complaints valued, but not valued just by us, but valued by landlords, and landlords to be able to resolve more complaints themselves and to be able to, without escalation to the Ombudsman, and to be able to learn from the reasons why complaints were presented to them in the first place to try and improve services to prevent complaints. And that's the goal that, and a shared, I think a shared ambition that the Ombudsman and the sector has. On the code itself, I think a kind of couple of comments that I'd make, and then I'll hand to Verity. I think one of the in achieving the outcome of strengthening internal complaints procedures, learning from complaints, to achieve that, complaints are more than transactions. They are more than individual transactions with individual residents. They should be, therefore, those kind of tools for learning, to horizon scan, to identify risks, to test culture, to test whether, practices are and behaviors are in line with what you would expect as an organization, in line with your organizational values, to see whether new approaches or policies are embedding in practice, or whether there's a disconnect between a policy and practice. It's far more than those individual transactions. They are there as tools for learning. But the code itself can sometimes be viewed very much on that kind of transactional platform. These are the timescales for stage 1 and stage 2. How do we do it? How do we meet it? And keep within those timescales. That stuff is important, of course, but I really don't want landlords to lose sight of the broader goal that the code has, which is to embed a positive complaint handling culture at a landlord level. I think the second thing which I'd say is the code has been around for a few years now, but a statutory code is a different world to what we had before. So old code, broadly speaking, new world is a message I'd really want to get across, which requires, obviously demonstration of, compliance with the code. But in demonstrating to us that landlords are meeting the code, there's again that opportunity for the organisation to own the code and own a positive complaint handling culture. It's not just about showing us what you're doing, it's about actually really embedding it as a piece of practice within the organisation. That ultimately is success. Success is not providing your self-assessment to the Ombudsman. Success is embedding a positive complaint handling culture. Right, I'm going to stop there, Matt.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Rick. Verity, I'll leave you to carry on and take on the baton.
Yes, absolutely. So morning, everyone. I'm Verity Richards. I'm the head of duty to monitor here at the Housing Ombudsman. My role has been for the last 6 months and a little longer to be part of the code consultation. So as Rick said, old code, new world, and part of that has been going through the consultation and to publish the new statutory code, and then working under Rick's direction and with the wider sector. Those of you who did do the consultation, you'll know that we've been working on our approach to monitoring compliance with that code, because excuse me, with the power to issue that statutory code comes a responsibility from our side as the Ombudsman. We have an obligation, a legal requirement to monitor compliance with that code. And as Rick said, it's not just about submitting that self-assessment to the Ombudsman. It's about making sure that that code is embedded, that policies are compliant, but really what's so vital is making sure that that practice is embedded across the organisation. Yes, there is a return to the Ombudsman, and absolutely we have a requirement, and we will be making sure that those are collected. For large landlords, that will be the 30th of June this year. For small organisations, it will be within 12 weeks of their end of their financial year. Over the next 12 months, we will be collecting all of those submissions. the really important thing is that, yes, policy being compliant is the practice. You know, as Rick said, not having a postcode lottery, can residents be really confident that if they have a complaint, they will be listened to, they will receive that response, and that will be learned from as part of that. So we published our code compliance framework, which sets out how we intend to monitor compliance against the code. The code was also published, itself was published at the same time in February. And as Rick said, yes, there have been some changes, but the code has been in place and been a requirement of members for quite some time. Excuse me. And since then, we've been releasing guidance. We've been working with the sector to make sure that they feel supported. So we've been running webinars, we've published guidance, lots of information to support landlords, to make sure that they are able to be compliant. But beyond that, really going beyond just those requirements and using the information that we have from our previous engagement with the sector, what really works in terms of really challenging yourselves as organisations about, is the information, you know, our knowledge and information management reports, so much learning of what's happening. Is information that you're relying on reliable, repeatable? Is it accurate? To inform that evidence base and to really be able to scrutinise the self-assessment itself, any reporting, and that side of things. So that's been a real focus for us. We know that the sector has been working really, really hard to get settled with the new requirements, but also to really make those self-assessments meaningful. I've heard some amazing discussions around how people have been using that self-assessment, ranging from organisations which have asked different members at different levels across their organisation to conduct a skeleton review against the self-assessment, comparing and contrasting them. So seeing the difference in the view from the board level versus a complaints manager. That's quite an interesting way of looking at it. And another organisation, a cooperative, where the residents have gone through in great detail, their scrutiny panel has gone through in great detail to really look at the evidence that's been provided, to feedback to board, to feedback to the responsible people who are delivering those services, to make sure that actually they are satisfied. Because as Rick said, yes, absolutely, we'll be looking at that self-assessment. It's setting out that you do comply with the code with all of the different provisions. But it is also really important to remember that this is your opportunity to be open and transparent with your residents. It's one of the reasons we require the self-assessment to be published. It's there so that residents can be reassured that if they do make a complaint, they can be confident that, yes, they are going to receive that level of service for their individual complaint, and then support them to feel confident that actually, yes, that complaint will be used for learning and informing future activities. Because, as you'll know, the code isn't just limited to how to handle an individual complaint. We also have our sections 8 and 9, which is about corporate reporting, excuse me, learning from complaints and making sure that those service improvements are made as a result. Because complaints can be an amazing opportunity, not only to fix or resolve challenges from customer experience, but it is also an opportunity to identify where there are gaps in the work, which could actually be leading to inefficiencies in processes. We've certainly seen that through our work, particularly with our special reports with featured landlords, where we've used our powers to conduct a much more focused learning report. One that I would really highlight is missed appointments. You know, it sounds so straightforward, but missed appointments quite frequently complained about. I used to be, was in social housing myself for 12 years, handled complaints on the other side. Missed appointments so frequently identified, but can really, how much is that costing every time? Those missed appointments, the repeat appointments, all of that communication that needs to happen beyond the frustration of a resident, which, you know, is really important to resolve. So looking at it through those lenses, resolving it from the customer journey and looking at where efficiencies can be made and improvements can be made. In terms of our wider work, so that's the code itself, we will be using all of our work to identify further good practice. We have over 1,700 landlords as members of the Housing Ombudsman. It's going to be very interesting going through all of those self-assessments, seeing all of the work that's happening from organisations where we may never have received a complaint. I would love to say that that's because everything is fine, and I hope it is. If that is working really well, there's probably some learning that we can share broadly across the sector. But if there are areas that we need to review and challenge, then we absolutely will do so. We already have a large number of areas that landlords have suggested to us. So through our webinars, we've been asking for feedback, for more information about what does the sector need, what do residents need to be able to either navigate the complaints process or hold their organisations to account. And we will be using all of our findings to provide further information to support landlords to handle complaints really well, to embed that positive complaint handling culture, looking at as many ways as we can to broaden that across the sector in a way that will drive those changes across the sector for residents and also for the landlords themselves. And I will stop there and I will hand over to Matt. I did promise that we would leave plenty of time for questions, which I can see are coming in.
There are plenty coming through, and I think it's just important. I think one of the things that both of you have mentioned there that I feel is certainly why, you know, not just why I wanted to get you on in the first place, but also I think that there was a real clarity between us, was that it comes down to culture. It comes down to accountability, and I think unfortunately our sector hasn't maybe evolved into the cultures and accountability that we've needed for the last few years. I know there's obviously been, you know, I've been at events with particularly with Rick, where there's been an awful lot of pushback sometimes on the power of the Ombudsman, on its focus and everything else. But I think when you speak to a lot of people in housing, they also understand that the sector is a bit broken at the moment and something needs to change to fix it. But I think also it comes down to, in Verity, I know you were saying before, just how much your teams have grown over the last 2 years is insane.
Yeah, it's been a really significant growth, and many of us have come from across the sector in various different places, different spaces. So I'm from a large landlord. I was there 12.5 years, done different things across those. We've got colleagues who have come from local authorities, from smaller co-ops. We have so many different people. But what I would say is that, you know, sometimes it can feel, you know, as you've said, it can be a little bit challenging, but ultimately we actually want the same as you, you know, as housing professionals who are here at, you know, discussing these things, is that we want to help make a real difference to residents and those services. And I know that sounds a bit cheesy because that is our vision, but genuinely that is what brings us together. And we're here to support the sector, but also to hold a mirror, you know, up to the sector and to shine those light, you know, that light on what you can learn from and take forward, to be that impartial voice.
I completely agree. So some questions that are coming through. If anyone would like to ask their question in person, please do. At the bottom of your screen, there will be a reactions piece. I can't think what to call it. Exactly what Steve's done there. Raise your hand. So Keith, sorry, Steve, I'll ask a couple of questions and I'll come to you. But if anyone would like to come in, please do just jump on the queue there. So there are a couple of points about board. So a question from Susan Healy, which had a number of thumbs up. How can you strengthen the need to improve the culture and that landlords are considering a tenant's diverse needs, as this seems to be a continuing theme in a lot of your judgments, where we're not taking an individual tenant need when providing services and repairs? So I don't know who would like to take that on, Verity or Rick.
Okay, well, we could both have a go at it, but that might not be helpful for you in the interest of time and getting.
Oh no, I think it's clarity is always useful.
So I think, so a couple of thoughts about this, and it works at different levels. So I think the first thing is reimagining the role of the complaints team, because one of the things which I like to try and convey to boards often is actually don't just look at your complaints team as that in that transactional way that I talked about, but actually look at them as a source of insight and learning for the organization as a whole, and that extends to culture. Because culture within an organization to be successful is part of a strategy. So you've got your vision, you've got your values, you've got your mission, and then you have a strategy to embed that, behaviors, frameworks, and so on. And so actually complaints are a really good test of how does that strategy work in practice on a daily basis, daily interactions between residents and landlord staff. What's it look like? Does it work? And so that I think tasking the complaints team to try and extract that information and giving them a presence to be able to talk about it, I think is really, really, really helpful. And and often I but I think it's really relevant. Talked about the way in which internal audit is used by an organisation to kick the tires on something, but then actually your complaints team, if it is independent within the organisation, which is a key thing, should be able to provide you with a sense of where things are working or things may not be working. I then think there's a broader thing around engagement with residents, and I think there's a number of different things that work there, which overlap and intersect. So I think the focus on individual circumstances is so important, and I think has sometimes been lost. If you just look at the hazards, for example, an understanding of the individual circumstances and the risks presented under the hazards, but sometimes that can be lost. There's then redress. If something has gone wrong, again, a recognition of the individual circumstances and an understanding of that when applying appropriate redress through the complaints process. There's communication. There's an understanding, again, really effective communication or ineffective communication can rest at the heart of some of the service failings that we investigate. Then I guess the last one is specifically around the Equality Act. And again, I think a real understanding of kind of responsibilities under the Equality Act and having due regard to it. Not just reasonable adjustments, but in a again, a kind of communication and approach, but broader. I think you piece all of that together, and there's a lot there for landlords to understand and different touch points. But I think which is one of the reasons why we've talked about in our last Spotlight report this idea of an exercise around the resident of the future, imagining the customer base over the next decade. And that maybe, if you haven't done it as a landlord, is one way to kind of facilitate a discussion around these various parts.
Thank you, Rick. Verity, anything you'd like to add?
I mean, Rick has beautifully summarised that. I think the other area that I'd encourage landlords to reflect on is knowing your tenants, and not just knowing your individual tenants, but knowing the picture of your residents and the needs of your residents sort of more broadly. It happened to be a small cooperative that we were sort of in conversation with, and we were talking about publication of the annual complaint handling and service improvement report, which is a requirement of the code. And they were saying, well, actually, we know that our residents have a second language. Most of our English is their second language. So would it be acceptable to publish it in an alternative language? And I said, well, yes, absolutely. Yes, we are going to look at it, but we're not your primary reader. The objective is to share that information with your residents. And it was just a really good example of where, they did actually have, they had that knowledge. It's a relatively small organization. So knowing your residents and knowing, that future of those communication needs and being aware of it and actually planning ahead. Because I think sometimes on the communication side of things, we've all perhaps over-relied on organisations like the Big Word, for translations and things. And actually, they're not that quick, not always that quick to do those translations. So if you can preempt it, it builds that trust, it builds that relationship, and that sense of being cared about and known, I think is important.
And so often that's what it is, exactly that. It's being realised that you are, you might not be a, an English speaking person, but it's okay because we've already thought about it rather than having to complain first. Thank you both. Steve, I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to try and get the balance right here between people jumping in and the chat. So Steve, I'm going to come to you first.
Good morning. Thanks, Matt. Good morning, Richard and Verity. I'm a tenant and I'm just getting a little bit concerned over the Ombudsman and the regulations that are coming through. It's not only about the complaints, it's a whole raft of regulations around other issues as well. But it seems like a never-ending circle. Yes, a lot of complaints have got to be looked at, have got to be dealt with. Organisations have got to do more to get it right, etc., etc. I completely agree with that. But some of the things coming through, I mean, I sit on a tenants committee and I've seen things where it's coming through where the customer doesn't have to use the word complaint when they comment on something for it to be a complaint. Now, that means that somehow the landlord has got to contact the customer to find out the issue they're having, which is putting stress on resources, and that no matter if it's only a off the cuff remark, it's got to be looked into. It's all costing money. Landlords have got a fixed income. So if they've got to take away money from one service to look at somebody who says, well, I'm not really happy about that, but that'll do. If they've got to, I mean, it all takes time and money for it to be looked into. And then landlords are being hit with things like over repairs, where I'm bringing another issue here, but it's all coming into it, where timeframes are being given for things to be done. And if they're not done, that then turns into a complaint. But everything, it's like a perfect storm for the landlord. But with a fixed income, that money's got to come from somewhere. And I can see coming forward a cut in services that are not part of the core business, like well-being services, money coaching, helping tenants get work and things like that. I can see those things being cut, but they're valuable to the local community. And if those things are going to start being cut, then there's going to be more complaints coming in. So I think there's got to be some middle ground for landlords and the Ombudsman to reach, because overall, to me, it's like a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And it's going the way where even if a customer says, well, I don't like the colour, that has got to be looked at as a complaint. Whether it's, whether it's meant as a complaint or not, it's got to be looked at. And I just find it overwhelming for the landlords. And I just worry about, other customer services and what effect it's going to have on them.
Rick, Verity, and a very, very fair point, and not the first one I've heard on this. I'll pass over to yourselves.
So I'll do a quick one around, and thanks, Steve. And I think that, thought-provoking contribution. So I think it's we should do justice to it. I'll probably, on the definition of a complaint, I'll leave that to Verity so that we both have something to say, because I think it's a really important one. But I'd say that the definition of a complaint that you see in the complaint handling code was a key part of the discussion that we had with representative bodies, both for tenants and landlords, as well as individual landlords, at the introduction of the code back in 2020. So it is kind of an important cornerstone, and there's good reasons around it. But just dealing on and I absolutely recognise that, and I said at the outset, the challenging operating environment for landlords. One way of looking at the Ombudsman's work, though, is considering the Ombudsman as a mirror. our work is often a reflection back to the landlord of its obligations, some of which will go back decades to things like the Landlord and Tenant Act, or its own commitments and its own policy. And so just dealing specifically with that issue around repairs, obviously the legislation expects that repairs are conducted in a kind of reasonable time frame. And often landlords will then codify that in their own repairs policy. Although there are some landlords that don't, and they're quite large ones, that haven't been able to produce a repairs policy when we've been investigating an individual case, which might raise some questions for them. But I think that, you know, if you as a landlord have, looked at the statute, and then looked at how you're going to respond to that, emergency repairs, urgent repairs, responsibility, worked it through, and then your complaints are showing you are not meeting that, I don't think that's a failure of the complaints process or that system. Those are reasonable expectations that the landlord itself has enshrined. And I think that is part of the learning from complaints that's required. And as I say, I think the Ombudsman's role is to be that mirror reflecting back to the landlord its obligations, some of which have been around for decades, its own commitments that are made in its policies, and where are the pressure points, where is the disconnect? And that's how I would view, sometimes the value and the role of complaints and the Ombudsman service. But you had a really specific point around the definition of a complaint and residents not always having to use the word complaint for a dissatisfaction to be treated as a complaint. And I'll let Verity talk a bit about that.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Yeah, so as Rick said, the original definition was then created back in 2020, and there was, it's before my time, but I know that there was quite a lot of discussion and different trade bodies, and was involved in giving some of the feedback from the other side at the time. And one of the key sort of intentions of that, and one of the things which sort of I took forward at the time when I was in the sector myself, was about the number of residents who actually just don't want to be a bother. There are still a lot of residents, and we still see that in our casework, particularly in our dispute support part of our service. So before a complaint has been through the complaints process, there's a real expression from residents around, well, I've been waiting for a really long time, I don't want to be a bother, I just want to know when it is. And actually that drifting for some significant amount of time, and those residents being sort of potentially overlooked or forgotten. We did consult on the complaint handling code back in the autumn. We had over 600 residents and organisations respond as part of that consultation. And Steve, some of the comments that you've made were absolutely were fed back, particularly from organisations and a number of residents. And one of the things which we heard very loudly in the consultation was the need to do the balance between residents who were really feeling the clear feedback from them was about, we're not being heard consistently. We don't know if our concerns have been picked up and been responded to, a lack of clarity around has a complaint been raised at all, but also the real importance of choice being offered not every resident wants to make a complaint. And that's absolutely fine. We're not here to tell them they must have a complaint every time. I mean, it wouldn't be right for us to do so. So one of the changes which was made through the consultation was where a resident expresses dissatisfaction, they must be given the choice to raise a complaint. It's not automatically raising complaints, it's the choice to make a complaint. And it is up to organisations to decide how they would do that. So I've had lots of conversations with different organisations about it. One of the things that we've been talking about has been quite often it's by telephone, quite often it's about repairs. So somebody will say, you know, I'm really unhappy, X, Y, Z. And organisations can then, you know, have the conversation, offer to put that right, do those, you know, do that. But they do need to give the choice to the resident to make that complaint. And if they wish to do so, then they do need to consider raising it. The policy we do set out, there are still a number of exclusions which can apply. So they may be excluded for a different reason. But it is really important that those voices are heard and that residents do have that choice. Through our casework, we have found numerous findings of informal complaints processes which have acted either in reality as a barrier to a resident making a complaint and actually then being diverted into another process, which ultimately hasn't been successful. And then also seen in our casework where the offer or, you know, I can do this for you, I can raise a complaint and it's going to be quite a long process and we can't do anything to help you until that complaint has been resolved, acting as a psychological barrier for a resident to make a complaint, and actually they have every right to do so, which is why that the intention of the provision in the code is to clearly offer that choice so that that resident's decision is at the heart of that process. Thank you.
And actually answered a few of the points that came up in the chat, which is, I think sometimes it's about that clarity of what is a complaint and what isn't. I think it's interesting that work has been done, but that isn't always the piece we go back to. So I really appreciate you both highlighting that. Laura, I'm going to come to you, and then we've got about 10 questions that have come in via the chat as well, but I've got Claire and Honey to come in too. So Laura, over to yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody, and lovely to see you, Richard, and lovely to meet you, Verity. My question is an opportunity for you to look forwards, because I know everybody's like looking at the past and sort of getting a bit, how can I put it, getting our knickers in a twist about the present. So my question is, considering how high the increase in complaints has been in the last 2 years, at what stage do you imagine in the future the number will start going down? And do you think that'll be, what's the thinking I'm thinking here? Do you think that'll be a reflection of genuine change in the sector, or we will just have circumnavigated, as we do really well, circumvented things so that the numbers go down?
Nice, easy question for you both there. Rick, over to you. Thank you, Laura.
Cool. Thanks, Laura. Important question. So I think if I take this one, every year that I've been in post as the Ombudsman, we've seen a double-digit percentage increase in the volume of complaints, which you'll be more than familiar with. And so therefore, in both our annual report and our business plan, we've tried to explore, well, why is that? And what we've said is that there are different factors coming into play, whether it's budgetary pressure, whether it's the age and design of some social homes, whether it's increased awareness and access. There are lots of different factors contributing to an increase in the volume of complaints. And overall, our assessment is that those factors will remain in play for the foreseeable future. Now, what time frame would you put on the foreseeable future? Well, I'd say for the next 3 to 5 years, I would continue to expect to see a high volume of complaints compared to what you might have expected, historically. I think what you would want to see is a decline in the maladministration rate by us, or the uphold rate by the landlord in its own internal complaints process, before you see a decline in the volume of complaints. Because otherwise you risk that idea that the complaints are being sort of driven underground, and actually the issues are not being examined. And what we've always been clear about is that the complaints process is, you know, part of that positive complaints culture is that the complaints process is there to be embraced. It's there as an opportunity to put things right, ensure there's fairness, you know, all of and learn, and avoiding a sort of defensive complaints culture where complaints are seen as a negative, I think is so important. So, you know, a high volume of complaints might demonstrate the landlord is really open and accessible, has a really open and accessible complaints process, rather than stuff being driven underground. And I definitely say in our analysis, you can see a correlation between both sometimes a high volume of complaints and there being very clear issues that the landlord needs to address. And so again, your complaints process is that canary in the coal mine. It's that telling you earlier that there's something not quite right that needs to be picked up. But we've also seen the converse, which is what appears to be an unusually low volume of complaints coming to us, and then suddenly, you know, other things become very evident, and you know, and we can see, well, actually, there wasn't an open complaints process, but there was still the same problems, and those suddenly burst onto the scene. So I think it's, you know, so I think, yeah, we certainly have planned on the basis for the next few years that, you know, complaint volumes will remain high. I think you'd want to see the uphold rate reduce before you saw a decline in complaints.
Thank you. Verity, I'll bring you in, but I know we've got a lot of people diving in. So I'm going to go to Claire, and then I'm going to start going through. I'll try and get Honey in quickly as well. It depends on the length of the questions. Claire, I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Matt. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire Patterson. I specialise in data protection in social housing, and I would be really interested on Rick and Verity's take on what I'm seeing. I think is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to some of these issues. That I know we're talking about know your residents, but I'm seeing a lot of data collection exercises starting, where landlords are either planning to or they're starting to collect huge amounts of personal data when they don't actually know how they're going to use it, which actually makes it unlawful and therefore by default unfair as well, because it's unlawful. And I'd be interested in your take on that and where we can advise landlords better, hopefully.
Thank you, Claire. I know it ties in actually with the question that coming on the chat regarding what do you say to an organisation or landlord, this from Judith, that puts policies in place that are manifestly unfair and break the law around data protection, and then seek to rely on those bad policies to try to justify bad behaviour instead of appropriately seeking to resolve complaints. So I'm really glad you've raised it. Rick, Verity, I don't mind who would like to come in on that one.
Verity, you go for it.
Mute myself. Thanks, Claire. Really, really interesting. And I have to say, a slightly vested interest myself. I used to be responsible for reporting related to diversity data. So you've spoken quite close to my heart there, I have to say. And I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a risk that landlords should be considering monitoring themselves, you know, at that corporate level. That it does pose a huge risk. You know, data protection, breach unlawful activities, you know, that is really key to them. I think in terms of advising landlords about, you know, their plans for collecting data, is that should be part of their strategy themselves for managing their information, and they should be challenging themselves in terms of, why do I need this information? What will it inform? And how do we plan to use it? Will it tell us anything that we can actually use to either assess our services, assess access to our services, or the delivery of those services? I've had quite a lot of discussions with organisations, because it is part of the code about, like I said, knowing residents, and suggesting that some organisations are planning to do it in a phased data collection approach. So they're focusing on communication initially and then working through those different the different strands of information that they may want to collect, and actually challenging themselves as they come to each position and the next data that they're collecting. Obviously that does risk I'm going to say survey fatigue, but information fatigue on residents, and that burden on residents. So I had encouraged them to really think about what their strategy was for setting out their reasons to do so. So that would be my advice, monitoring that at the corporate risk and to be really clearly challenging that. And the landlord's data protection officer should be acting in that way internally also.
When they know
that's
it's
always one of
happening.
the points, isn't it? It's about having a specialist internally. Sorry, Claire.
Yeah.
Sorry, that a lot of these things are going ahead without even thinking about the words data protection, because data protection is seen as just being about security rather than it being about, should we collect this information in the first place? What's our lawful basis? And there's so much behind that, which I'm very passionate about this. I could talk about it all day, but I won't.
I think
maybe another time.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, we have our knowledge and information management report, which really encourages organisations to look at and think about those things. But fortunately or unfortunately for you now, Claire, I now have your name. So as we develop our work with the code, that is absolutely something that I will now add to my list of never-ending extra information that we can support with landlords. So thank you, that's really helpful. But noted, I'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Honey, I'm going to bring you in and then I'm going to the points in the chat because we've had a number come through. We might do a bit of a kind of quick fire last 10 minutes. So Honey, over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Richard and Verity. It's really interesting to hear. Obviously, I am Hani Premlal. I've been working in the sector almost 3 decades as well. So I have a comment and a question, and then I realized Lara, my good friend, actually stole my question first. So my question was, there's an increase in complaints, especially over the last 2 years. Ombudsman all over the media, I must say. You're doing a very good job, Richard. So I was wondering, I can't think of the sector has gone backwards because, I've seen the passion and the amount of work is going. Everyone, I've been like all of us with that, accountability, honesty, the passion. That's what we're here for. Where things gone wrong, or is it Ombudsman coming with that code? Is giving that tool to really go through that lens and say that's going wrong. That's one thing. That was my question. But in terms of comments, I would say I agree with you. From the board level, the complaints must be taken as a way of learning, improving, listening, rather than, why these are many complaints. The board should be thinking a bit more different lens. I know in my board, we just appointed one of the board members as a board champion to look at different perspective and talk to residents and really understand how can we change things differently. So I think the culture change is fundamental, rather than, oh my God, that we got 10 complaints, we are doing something wrong. But yes, we might be doing something wrong. Can we do things differently? So it's a bit comment and a bit question, Richard, is that because you're now Ombudsman is everywhere. Before it was not that obvious. Is that making that change?
Thanks, Honey. A great question, and so I think one thing which is distinct about the way in which an ombudsman works is to also consider what is fair, what is, best practice, what is fair. And so I think there is an element to our work where you are, and you'll have seen this with damp and mold and this idea around consideration of individual circumstances and lifestyle, and the response to reports where perhaps practice has been normalized in a way which with reconsideration is not necessarily delivering the right outcomes or the best outcomes. So I think there is an element of our work where we're not just looking at things in a very kind of narrow lens of like right and wrong, although we are obviously making our decisions based on the framework of the law and the landlord's own interpretation of the law, or its policy, but also what is fair and reasonable. And I think damp and mold is a really good example to understand actually how complaints can enable landlords to reconsider, or empower landlords to reconsider, actually, is our approach right here? And it's not, but I don't think it's the only example. I think there's others as well. And if I gave, for example, an area where I'm, there's definitely, I think at the moment, in my mind, if I was to look at some of the casework that I see, a kind of question about the interaction between responsive repairs and planned works, and getting that right as a landlord, because sometimes I'm seeing a response to a repair being deferred because of planned works, but that's not necessarily fair in the circumstances, or actually meeting obligations the landlord may have. So I think there's lots of different ways to just continuously engage with the complaints that you see, and not just think, oh, we're doing something right or wrong, but actually, what is fundamentally our approach here? What do we want to achieve as an organisation, and how do our complaints help us inform that?
What I'm finding really interesting almost across the sector at the moment is just how many businesses are really starting to reduce housing officer patch sizes because of the complaints code, and how it's taken that being the thing that's gone, right, actually, we should probably know our residents better. Patches of 700-800 aren't suitable anymore. And it's been interesting that actually until this came along, that wasn't seen as necessarily the best way to run the business. And I appreciate there's the business side, and there's all of those challenges that come with it as well. But I think there've already been a number of changes that have come that maybe weren't even associated with the complaints code, but having to be in order to get on top of the code. But they're basically just really good customer service. So, there's a challenge across the sector, and I don't think we can get away from that. But equally, it's good to see some changes being made quite positively. I'm going to do some quick fire questions that have come through. We'll get through as many as we can. I haven't written everyone's name down, so if I don't mention your name, please don't think I'm not attributing it to you. But the first one that I've got here: should the Housing Ombudsman direct landlords to consider your focus spotlight reports themselves? It seems strange that some landlords have not considered these reports with their tenants groups. Is this something you actively engage with, Rick or Verity?
I'll do a quick answer to that. I think it's sometimes we will order a landlord through an individual investigation to self-assess against a report. I think overall, both those reports and the Centre for Learning is something we'd encourage landlords to engage with, rather than feeling the need to compel landlords to do it. But I think, something we will certainly consider in the future is whether or not actually we need to get into a cycle of encouraging landlords to consider the reports, rather than in a more proactive way. Overall, what we find is really positive engagement with those reports. So overall, it feels like landlords are valuing it and are engaging with it.
Fantastic. What is the Ombudsman looking to see from the next government in terms of support for the sector to deliver to expectations, either the suggested Royal Commission or addressing the fundamental supply chain issues?
Okay, nil response. We're in Purda, so we can't.
Thank you very much. How is the Ombudsman engaging with customers to ensure they know they can escalate a complaint to them, and about awareness of the code itself? Verity, I've seen you've come off. You can dive in on this one.
Yeah, I can dive in on this one. So we've been doing considerable work, not only so on our own website, so making sure that our requirement, our service is available. It's embedded in the code that landlords must make their tenants aware of us as part of the complaints process, so supporting them. But also, we've been working with the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities on their awareness campaign, which has got significant reach. I believe we're at around 77% of residents surveyed had said that they were aware of the Ombudsman, which has been a massive shift, but we will always look to do more.
I think, judging by how many complaints you're getting through directly, it's clear that uplift is taking, and certainly from the businesses I've worked with in terms of recruiting complaints managers, specialist teams, everyone is diving after the same staff, and that could be another huge issue we might have moving forward. There are many social housing residents who would struggle to bring a complaint to our attention, would require a lot of support to have the confidence to do this. Support is vital and can take a number of interactions to ensure we do pick up on all aspects of the complaint, but also of their experience and how the failing has impacted them. Are there plans to look at suggested housing associations advocates that are able to do this? I recall this was mentioned in a previous webinar a year or so ago, but haven't heard any more on it yet.
So sort of reflecting back with what Rick said at the start, absolutely recognise that it's really challenging. Where we've been starting our work is to be engaging with support organisations such as Citizens Advice. So we've been meeting with them quite regularly to answer questions, make sure that they're aware of the code, and that they can support residents that go to them. It would be something that I'm sure that we would want to see in the future, but that is quite a significant shift in services and culture. So we also have our dispute support team who are able to support on those individual complaints. So more for the future, I think, on that, unless you want to add anything, Rick.
No, lovely. From colleagues and peers this person's spoken to, what would be of most benefit is engaging constructively with landlords at dispute resolution stage. Is this something we feel we can improve on collectively?
Not Verity.
Thank you. So yeah, no, absolutely. So in terms of the offer that we have, so our dispute support team will make people aware, engaging constructively. We aim to, with those landlords, to bring them together. Our aim really is to resolve as many complaints in the landlord's complaints procedure. We know that's the most effective place, not only for residents, but also for landlords. In terms of our work, once a complaint has already been accepted by the Ombudsman, we're constantly reviewing and reflecting on how we can make that interaction more efficient, more beneficial, and offer those opportunities to resolve complaints in the most effective point, either through mediation, it could be through negotiation, but ultimately, once a complaint has been made to us, we do have a legal obligation to do that investigation, but open to continuously reviewing and improving that.
Well, look, I'm aware we've got about 2 minutes left and you've both got 12 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap it up. There are more questions on local authorities, voids, further change and things, which I'll make sure I get over to you so that we can get those kind of answered moving forward. I want to say a big thank you to you both for coming on. Are there any final words you'd like to say before we wrap today up?
Well, from me, Matt, a big thank you for hosting. And a big thank you to everyone attending, because I think it is a demonstration actually of the increased engagement and positive attitudes towards making complaints, using complaints to make a difference. And
Verity?
Absolutely. I just want to thank everyone for their time and also all of the comments. We will make sure that we get back to you. Thank you for your honesty and for giving some really thought-provoking questions. I think that's really important for us to go away and reflect on that, and that's why we think these are so important. So thank you to you, Matt.
Oh, I'm delighted. The point in this is to bring forward collaborative discussion. It's exactly what we've done. So the recording will go live later this week. Feel free to anybody who's joined to share it around. If you've any additional questions, do reach out to me, or if you'd like to join the mailing list, you're more than welcome. But for now, Rick and Verity, thank you very, very much, and I'll wrap today up. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks.